In the previous video, we looked at LUN masking both from the storage array side as well as from vscsi. In this video, we're going to look at the vscsiStats tool, which is a relatively unknown tool but of tremendous use if we use it properly. So we're going to talk about using the vscsiStats tool, and we will also show you how to do some reporting from the output of the vscsiStats run, including some ideas as to some websites that provide some tremendous information for being able to visualize the output of the reporting from the vscsiStats tool. So now we are back in familiar territory. We are looking at our 192.168.0.201 host, and we are going to key in vscsi with a capital S, that is very important, and dash help, and we are going to pipe it to more. So this tool, vscsiStats, it controls the data collection for virtual machine disk I/O workload characterization. So basically what it does is it does data collection for virtual machine disk I/O workload, and it characterizes it. What that means is that it tells you what the inter-arrival time was, which is what is the time between IOs. It tells you the length of IOs and the number of IOs in that category for both reads and writes. It gives you information, or rather collects information about IO latencies and so on. Really useful information. Now of course the situation is that modern storage arrays actually intercept these commands, which are basically SCSI commands, and the information there, and it is intercepted and then it is recreated so that it works best for that array, and that's especially true for SSDs. So even though spinning disks are becoming less used because of the usage of SSD, or even if there is a spinning disk, for example in the hybrid storage arrays which have front-end SSDs and then do back-end writes onto spinning disk, the actual place where the data is finally placed is quite different from where the original basic SCSI command wanted to put it. So even though in many cases it may not be directly useful, but still as an indication of the type of an I/O workload that a virtual machine actually creates, whether it's random or sequential, whether it does a lot of small IOs, a lot of large IOs, and how often it does that, is excellent information to assist one in visualizing how to tune the characteristics of that virtual machine, or how best to place it for maximum business benefit. So with that, the vscsiStats command with the H prints this usage which you just saw. We will first list the available virtual machines and their virtual disks. Before we actually go there, let me ensure that there are some virtual machines that are actually running on this system. Well, I've powered on 3 virtual machines, so there are some virtual disks that are going to be utilized. Let's take a look at what we find here. So vscsi with the capital S stats-L will give us the world IDs of those VMs. So one world group ID is 80117. Let's remember this, and let's start the data collection for this world ID. The command is quite simple: vscsiStats dash S for start, dash W for the world ID, which is 80117, and this starts the data collection. So starting the vscsiStats collection for world group, and handle ID is 8192, which basically is the virtual SCSI disk, this one here. Okay, so it started successfully. I'm going to pause the video for a few minutes and wait for more data to be actually accumulated before we take a look at see what we have available. The data collection is still running. I deliberately am going to let that run because I want to show you something else in the meantime. Let's take a deeper look as to what kind of information vscsiStats actually does collect. So let's look at the help again with the pipe to more and look at this section here. So what kind of a histogram is actually presented, and one can actually specify all, which means that you will get information about the IO length, which is the length of the IO, the seek distance, which is how much the head actually has to travel. Again, this is spinning disk, how much the head has to travel before it finds the actual sector onto which it will then write that block. The outstanding IOs at any given point in time, which is actually even now quite useful, including the latency as well. Inter-arrival is also relatively useful because it gives us the interval between SCSI commands that are coming to that disk. So with this, let's see how much information we have collected in this amount of time. The way to actually look at this would be to say, for your world, which was 80117-P, let's try all first, and we should actually do that with a more. So this is what we see. We are looking at a text-based histogram of IO lengths of commands for virtual machines, which is basically that virtual machine and it on this virtual disk. So you can see that the minimum IO length was 4096. The maximum IO length was quite large, and there was a mean and 69 IOs that were completed in this length of time that this data is being collected. Now, in terms of a histogram, the way to look at it is this. So how many instances? Well, 44 instances of less than and equal to 4096, 12 instances of 8192, which is good, and then 2 instances and 1 instance and 3 instances. So there were very few IO length of commands that were extremely high. Let's hit the space bar. Now we look at IO length for read commands, and you can see that there were 11 reads of 4096 and 2 reads that were much larger. Hit the space bar again, and I get the IO lengths for write commands. So most of the writes again are 4096. There was one which was relatively large for some reason. So this is for read commands, write commands, and then IO commands combined. The next histogram gives us the distance in logical block numbers between successive commands for virtual machines. So this tells you whether the usage of storage by this machine is random or sequential. So you start from say 0. Okay, so most of them were very far away. 22, it had to move less than 1, but it looks like after the initial startup, most of the distance between successive commands was extremely small. So I think if we gather information for a larger amount of time, this number will become high, and the anomaly of this extremely large LBNs would be eliminated. Okay, now we are looking at read commands only, distance in LBNs read commands, and then the next one would be distance in LBNs between successive write commands for that as well. Okay, then we have the distance between each command from the closest of previous 16. So this becomes even more granular. Latency is always interesting. Latency of IO in microseconds. So let's look at the latency. So the mean was 149 microseconds, maximum was 28,000, which was relatively high, and the total count of IOs is basically 69. So we are generally in this ballpark, it looks like, which is not too bad. There's nothing much happening on this anyway. And then of course the latency then becomes the read IOs latency. So this is where one can actually check your caching effectiveness, especially if you're using maybe flash read cache. I guess that would show up here as well. Latency of write IO, it's just the effectiveness of the storage array. And then number of outstanding IOs. So this is also very useful in looking at whether the storage array is being overwhelmed by the I/O coming from the virtual machine, you can see that 47 out of 69, there was only one outstanding I/O that was still pending when this was issued. So that's really good. And then of course that's broken down into read IOs when a new read IO is issued. Okay, and this is for the writes, which is probably more relevant. It takes longer to write IOs, but again the new storage arrays do this very effectively. They write back later on, and there are different ways of taking care of their front-end SSD being offloaded to spinning disk in the case of hybrid arrays. And then of course you have the latency of I/O inter-arrival time for reads. You have the total latency of I/O inter-arrival. So you can see that up here 11 times your arrival time between your commands was 1000 microseconds, and so it goes. So vscsiStats is an extremely useful tool to be able to determine the I/O pattern for virtual machines. Even with the arrival of the new storage arrays, at least the I/O pattern for the virtual machine can be determined, and then perhaps that information can be used to determine what characteristics you are actually looking for before you purchase a new storage array. Now we saw the output from vscsiStats could be displayed right there on the vscsi command line using like a text-based histogram, but obviously it looks much better if we are then able to take this information and send it into different graphical tools. I have not yet shown you how to generate CSV files, but we will as soon as we get back from this screen. So I actually like this site a lot. This is the vmpeat.com site, and if you look at this specific page, which is for using vscsiStats to better visualize storage I/O, just to give you a flavor for the kind of things that can be done from the files that can be exported. If you just look at these, right? This is the latency stuff we looked at. Just before that was the I/O size. You remember that. The latency of I/Os, the outstanding I/Os, the sequential versus random, because you understand what the pattern is from your virtual machine. And so there are many different ways to visualize this so that you are able to then get a grasp on what exactly you are looking for in your new storage array. And this site also has some really interesting other links, such as this one, for how to leverage vscsiStats to generate multiple sampling periods and so on. And then of course there are some nice templates that are also available there as well. So I would highly recommend that you look at this site vmpeat.com to be able to better visualize the storage I/O that you and the information that you get out from vscsiStats. So we are back now on our ESXi console here, and we had left vscsiStats running. So let's look at the commands for stopping vscsiStats. It is done with the -x, and the dash, as of course we've seen, starts it. -r is interesting because it will reset the stats and just keep going. One remaining option that we not looked at was the -c CSV. Basically what happens if you specify -c, you can then send it over to a file which is a comma delimited file, and then that can then be imported into other products such as Microsoft Excel or other products that can then give you those really nice graphical representations of the data that has been collected by vscsiStats to enable you to better visualize what it is that you're looking at in terms of the I/O capabilities and the I/O patterns from your virtual machines. So we've just completed our look into the vscsiStats tool. With that, we're going to move to the next video, which would be on VMKFS tool, which is a very sharp knife in your tool set to allow you to actually carve up your devices as you need. So with that, I look forward to seeing you on the next video.